The rain fell hard over New York City, not the gentle kind that cleaned the streets, but the heavy kind that pressed everything down, as if the city itself was holding its breath, and on a narrow street near the old docks, where broken streetlights flickered like tired eyes, a black convoy of luxury cars rolled to a silent stop, their engines purring with controlled power, announcing without sound that someone important had arrived, and from the center car stepped Victor Moretti, a man whose name carried weight in every corner of the city, a Mafia Kingpin known not just for his wealth and control, but for an aura that made grown men lower their eyes, a man whose power stretched from underground mafia clubs to quiet offices where state decisions were whispered over expensive whiskey, and yet tonight his face showed something no one had ever dared to speak of out loud: fear, because for 7 days his daughter Sophia had been missing, and no amount of money, threats, or contacts had brought her back, not the police he controlled, not the politicians who owed him favors, not even the shadows that usually answered when he called. And as Victor stood under the rain, his tailored coat darkening, his mind replayed the last phone call from Sophia, her voice shaking, the sound of traffic, then silence, a silence that had grown louder with every passing hour, and around him his men stood alert, armed, loyal, but helpless, because power means nothing when love is bleeding, and that was when a small figure stepped out from between two abandoned buildings, a thin orphan boy no older than 12, soaked, barefoot, holding the leash of a muddy, tired dog with sharp eyes, and one of Victor's men raised his gun instantly, ready to erase the interruption, but the boy did not flinch. He simply looked up at Victor with a calm that felt wrong for someone so young, and in a clear, steady voice he said words that cut through the rain and into the Kingpin's chest: "My dog can find your lost daughter." And for a moment, time froze, the rain still fell, the city still breathed, but everyone felt it, the way those words landed, heavy and dangerous, and Victor slowly turned his head to look at the boy, his dark eyes narrowing not in anger, but in disbelief mixed with a strange pull, because the boy's voice carried no fear, no greed, no lie, and Victor had spent a lifetime reading men who lied for money, power, or survival, and this child had none of that. And Victor stepped closer, his presence towering, his shadow swallowing the boy, and said quietly, "You know who I am," and the boy nodded once and said, "You're the man everyone is afraid of, but you're also a father who can't sleep anymore," and a murmur moved through the guards, because no one spoke to Victor like that and lived, but Victor raised a hand to silence them, because something inside him stirred, something human, something dangerous, and he asked, "What's your name?" and the boy answered, "Luca." And then looked down at his dog, gently touching its wet fur, "And this is Nero," and Victor almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the idea was insane, a street orphan and a dirty dog offering hope where armies had failed, and yet desperation makes room for miracles, and Victor said slowly, "If this is a trick, you die," and Luca met his eyes and replied, "If I'm lying, I don't deserve to live anyway," and there was something in that honesty that cut deeper than any threat. And Victor turned away for a moment, staring at the city lights reflecting in puddles, thinking of Sophia as a child, how she used to follow him with questions, how he promised to protect her from everything, except this, and when he turned back, he nodded once and said, "Get in the car," and Luca hesitated only to ask, "Nero too?" and Victor said, "Especially the dog," and as the convoy moved, the city swallowed them again, carrying with it a decision that would shake lives far beyond that street, because Victor did not know it yet, but this boy was not just an orphan, and this dog was not just a dog, and the path they were about to walk would test every moral line Victor had ever crossed, and inside the warm leather interior of the car, Luca sat quietly, Nero's head resting on his lap, while Victor watched them from across the seat, studying the boy's calm breathing, the way he held the leash not like an owner, but like a partner, and Victor finally asked, "How does your dog find people?" and Luca answered simply, "He listens to the world," and Victor frowned, because power was supposed to be loud, violent, absolute, not quiet and patient, and as they drove through the night, past mafia clubs glowing with red light and guarded doors, past streets Victor owned without owning. Luca stared out the window, seeing a world he had never been invited into, while Victor stared inward, feeling something shift, a crack in the armor he wore every day. And when they reached the Moretti estate, a fortress hidden behind iron gates and old trees, Victor's men moved fast, scanning, securing, controlling, because this was New York City power and contacts control at its finest. And yet even here, Victor felt exposed, because hope is the most dangerous thing a powerful man can carry. And inside the estate, Luca was given dry clothes, simple food, and a place by the fire for Nero, and Victor watched silently from the shadows, seeing how the boy thanked every servant, how Nero waited patiently before eating, and it reminded Victor of something long forgotten: humanity. And later, in his private office filled with dark wood and old photos, Victor questioned Luca again, not with threats this time, but with curiosity, asking where he came from, and Luca said he grew up in shelters, streets, forgotten places, that Nero found him first, that they survived together. And Victor asked why he approached him tonight, and Luca said, because your daughter is still alive, and time matters. And Victor felt his chest tighten, because every expert told him the opposite, and he asked how Luca knew, and Luca pointed to Nero and said, he's restless when people are suffering. And Victor almost dismissed it, but then his phone rang, and it was one of his most trusted contacts inside the police department, confirming a lead had gone cold, another dead end. And Victor closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and said words that surprised even himself, tomorrow, you and your dog will try. And Luca nodded, not smiling, not celebrating, because he knew the weight of what was coming. And that night, as Victor sat alone with a glass of untouched whiskey, he looked at a photo of Sophia smiling at the ocean, and for the first time since she vanished, he whispered, please, not to God, not to fate, but to a sleeping orphan boy and a dog in his house. And far away, in a dark room beneath the city, Sophia opened her eyes in chains, unaware that hope had just found its way into her father's world. And as dawn approached, the rain finally stopped, leaving the city wet, quiet, and waiting, because the game had changed, and power alone would no longer decide the outcome. Morning arrived at the Moretti estate, not with sunlight, but with a cold gray sky that pressed low over the city. And Victor Moretti had not slept. He had sat through the night in his study, listening to the quiet breathing of a house that was never truly quiet, because power never rests, it only waits. And when the first guards reported in, when the cooks began moving, when the engines of patrol cars hummed softly outside the gates, Victor stood and adjusted his cufflinks, his face once again the calm mask that ruled New York's underworld. Yet inside him something had shifted, because hope had entered his world uninvited, and hope changes the rules. And across the hall, in a guest room far from luxury, Luca woke before anyone called him, the boy's instincts shaped by streets and shelters. And Nero lifted his head the moment Luca's eyes opened, their bond silent and complete. And when a maid knocked softly and offered breakfast, Luca thanked her with a shy nod, eating slowly, saving half for Nero, because survival teaches you to think ahead. And Victor watched all of this through discreet eyes, noticing details he never cared about before, the kindness of the boy, the patience of the dog, and it made him uneasy, because he had built his empire on control, not compassion. And yet here it was, walking freely through his fortress, and by mid-morning, Victor gathered his inner circle, men who controlled docks, clubs, judges, and police captains, men who had killed without blinking for him. And when they saw Lucas standing beside Victor, some frowned, some laughed quietly, and one spoke out, saying this was madness, trusting an orphan and a dog. And Victor silenced them with a single look, his authority absolute, and said, today, we follow the dog. And that sentence alone marked a crack in the foundation of his rule, because Victor Moretti did not follow anyone. And Luca knelt beside Nero outside the gates, removing the leash, letting the dog sniff the ground, the air, the wind. And for a long moment nothing happened. Then Nero stiffened, ears alert, body tense, and began moving toward the city, not running, but walking with purpose, and Victor ordered the convoy to follow at a distance, resisting the urge to rush, because something told him this could not be forced, and as they moved through New York's veins, past old neighborhoods Victor once bled for, past shiny towers built with dirty money, Nero led them into places Victor rarely entered anymore. Areas without cameras, without protection, where humanity lived raw and exposed, and Luca walked beside Victor's car when it slowed, explaining quietly that Nero followed emotions more than smells, fear, pain, despair, and Victor listened, skeptical yet drawn in, because this language was new to him, and eventually Nero stopped at the edge of an abandoned subway entrance, sealed off years ago after a collapse, a place Victor knew well, because it was territory disputed by smaller crews, men who didn't answer to him directly, and Victor's jaw tightened, because this meant conflict, blood, choices, and as his men moved to secure the area, Luca placed a hand on Nero's head, whispering calm, and Victor noticed how the dog responded instantly, loyalty without fear, and something deep inside him ached, because he wondered if Sophia ever trusted him that way, and inside the dark tunnel, the air was cold and damp, echoes stretching endlessly, and Victor's men hesitated, guns raised. Because this place smelled of traps and death, and Victor stepped forward anyway, because power means stepping where others fear, and deeper inside, they found signs of recent activity, food wrappers, footprints, chains dragged across concrete, and Victor's chest tightened, because this was real now, and then they heard voices, rough laughter, men arguing over money, and Victor signaled silence, his mind calculating, identifying accents, recognizing one voice in particular, a mid-level trafficker who once begged for Victor's protection and was denied, and anger burned hot, because betrayal offended Victor more than violence, and as they prepared to strike, Lucas suddenly whispered, "Wait," and Victor turned sharply, ready to snap, but the boy's face was pale, eyes focused, and he said, "She's close, and scared, if you rush, they'll hurt her," and Victor froze, torn between instinct and trust, and for the first time in decades, he chose trust, ordering his men to stand down. And instead he stepped forward alone, calling the trafficker by name, his voice calm, deadly, offering a deal, protection, money, a chance to live, and inside the tunnel, fear spread faster than gunfire, because Victor Moretti's voice meant consequences, and the trafficker stumbled out, shaking, denying at first, lying badly, and Victor listened patiently, then said quietly, "Bring my daughter," and when Sophia was dragged into the light, bruised but alive, time stopped, Victor's breath caught. His mask cracked, and for a second he was not a kingpin, not a ruler of mafiahood and mafia clubs, but a father staring at his child, and Sophia's eyes met his, filling with tears, and Victor moved toward her, slowly, carefully, as if she might disappear, and when he wrapped his coat around her shoulders, she broke down, clinging to him, and Victor felt something he had buried long ago, guilt, love, humanity crashing through his armor, and behind him, Lucas stood quietly, Nero at his side. Watching, and Victor knew this was not the end, because power always demands payment, and later, after the traffickers were dealt with in ways that did not involve police reports, Victor took Sophia home, surrounding her with doctors and guards, but she slept peacefully for the first time in days, safe, and Victor stood outside her room all night, listening to her breathe, while Luca waited downstairs, expecting nothing, and at dawn, Victor approached him, his voice softer than any man had ever heard it, and said, "You saved my daughter," and Luca replied simply, "She wanted to live," and Victor nodded, because that truth cut deeper than gratitude, and he offered Luca money, homes, protection, anything, and Luca looked at Nero, then back at Victor, and said, "I don't want to disappear," and Victor frowned, because no one refused him, and Luca continued, "I want a place where Nero and I belong," and Victor felt something shift again, realizing this boy was not asking for charity, but connection, and as New York woke up, unaware of the silent war fought beneath its streets, Victor Moretti made a decision that would ripple through his empire, because saving his daughter had cost him something far greater than money. It had reminded him of love, and love is the most dangerous power of all. The city did not know it yet, but by the time the sun climbed over the skyline that morning, Victor Moretti's empire had already begun to change, because power built only on fear can stand for years, but power touched by humanity either transforms or collapses, and Victor stood at that edge now, watching Luca and Nero in the wide garden of his estate, the boy sitting cross-legged on the grass, the dog resting his head on Luca's knee, both calm, both belonging nowhere and everywhere at once, and Victor felt an unfamiliar tension in his chest, because he had rescued his daughter, crushed those who dared to take her, restored his control over the streets beneath the city, and yet his mind kept returning to one question that would not leave him alone. Why had this boy come to him, out of all the men in New York, and why had fate chosen his house to place such quiet power? And Sophia, still weak but alive, watched from her bedroom window, wrapped in blankets, her eyes following Luca with curiosity, because she remembered his face from the tunnel, remembered how calm she felt when Nero stepped between her and her captors, and later that day she asked her father who the boy was, and Victor struggled for words, finally saying, "Someone who reminded me who I am," and Sophia smiled faintly, because she had always hoped her father could be more than the shadow he lived in, and Victor ordered Luca to be educated, protected, given comfort, but Luca resisted gently, asking instead to help around the house, to feel useful, and Victor allowed it, surprising his staff, because no one ever negotiated with Victor Moretti and walked away with dignity intact, and days passed, and rumors spread quietly through mafia clubs and whispered phone calls, about how Victor personally led an operation, how he spared lives where blood was expected, how he had let a child walk freely through his fortress, and some saw this as weakness, others as evolution, and among those watching closely was Isabella Romano, a woman of intelligence, grace, and dangerous loyalty, who managed Victor's legitimate fronts and carried state-level connections in her phone like chess pieces, and Isabella noticed the change immediately, the hesitation in Victor's voice during meetings, the way his eyes softened when Luca entered the room, and she warned him carefully that enemies would test this shift, because New York respects power, not sentiment, and Victor listened, but did not retreat, because something inside him refused to go back to the man he was before the tunnel, and Luca, sensing tension, began speaking to Victor in small moments, sharing thoughts shaped by survival, telling him that fear breeds noise, but calm reveals truth, and Victor found himself listening, even learning, which terrified him more than any rival ever had, and one evening, as rain returned softly to the city, Victor took Luca to one of his oldest mafia clubs, a place of red velvet, low music, and heavy secrets, not to expose him, but to show him the world Victor ruled, and Luca walked through it with quiet eyes, seeing the loneliness behind wealth, the hunger behind smiles, and he asked Victor if all this power made him happy, and Victor did not answer immediately, because happiness was a language he had forgotten, and that night, as enemies gathered, sensing an opening, Victor stood at a crossroads. Unaware that the boy he had brought in for shelter was about to become the moral compass of a man who controlled New York City power and contacts control, and far beyond the walls of the club, forces began moving, because whenever a king shows humanity, the wolves come closer, and the real test of dark love, loyalty, and unexpected connection was only beginning. The city had already chosen its sides, though no one spoke of it openly, and Victor Moretti could feel it in the air, that subtle tightening that comes before violence, the way phone calls ended faster, the way certain men avoided eye contact, the way Isabella's voice carried urgency even when she spoke calmly, because power in New York never sleeps, it only shifts hands when weakness is sensed, and Victor's recent choices had been noticed, interpreted not as mercy, but as softness, and softness invites challenge, and Luca felt it too, though he could not name it in the language of mafia politics. He sensed it in Nero's restlessness, the dog pacing at night, ears twitching at distant sounds, reacting to emotions carried on the wind. And one evening, as Victor reviewed reports in his study, Lucas stood quietly at the doorway and said, "Someone is angry," and Victor looked up sharply, because the boy had no access to intelligence networks, no contacts in mafia clubs, and yet his instinct aligned perfectly with the data in Victor's hands: reports of smaller crews meeting, whispers of a coalition forming under a name Victor had buried years ago, Salvatore Kane, a former ally turned enemy, a man who believed fear alone should rule, and who had lost territory and respect when Victor spared lives in the subway tunnels. And Isabella warned that Kane was reaching into old wounds, reminding men of how Victor once ruled without hesitation, painting Luca as a liability, a symbol of weakness. And Victor listened, jaw-tight, because Kane was not wrong about one thing: love complicates power, and yet Victor refused to remove Luca from his life, because doing so would be admitting that compassion was a mistake, and he would not allow that, not after looking into Sophia's eyes, not after seeing what humanity had returned to him. And so Victor made a dangerous choice. He brought Luca deeper into his world, not to corrupt him, but to protect him, believing that understanding creates armor stronger than ignorance. And Luca listened as Victor explained the balance of power, the rules of mafiahood, the unspoken laws that governed mafia clubs, favors, and blood debts. And Luca absorbed it all with a quiet seriousness that unsettled Victor, because the boy did not recoil, nor did he glorify it. He simply understood, and he asked questions that cut deeper than bullets, asking who decided who deserved mercy, who decided when violence ended. And Victor found himself without clean answers, because his empire had never required them before. And that night, Kane struck not with guns, but with fear, orchestrating an attack on one of Victor's legitimate businesses, a charity hospital funded quietly to ease Victor's conscience, sending a message that humanity would be punished. And Victor arrived at the scene to see chaos, glass shattered, patients evacuated, his name whispered with doubt, and anger burned hot in his chest, because Kane had crossed a line, not of territory, but of morality. And as Victor's men prepared retaliation, Lucas stood beside him, Nero tense, and said softly, "If you answer fear with fear, it will never end." And Victor nearly snapped, because this was not a lesson moment, this was war. And yet Isabella stepped in, agreeing that Kane wanted escalation, wanted Victor to return to the old ways so the city could justify choosing sides against him. And Victor realized Kane was not trying to defeat him, but to expose him, to force him to choose between power and humanity. And that realization cut deeper than any wound, because Victor knew the truth: he could not be both without sacrifice, and that sacrifice would hurt someone he now cared about. And late that night, Victor found Lucas sitting with Sophia, reading to her quietly, the boy's voice calm, Sophia's breathing steady. And Victor watched from the doorway, feeling an ache he could not name, because this was the life he had never believed he could have. Connection without fear, love without control. And in that moment, Victor made a promise to himself, one that would either save his empire or destroy it completely. And as Kane gathered forces in the shadows, confident that Victor would break, Victor began planning not just a counterattack, but a transformation, unaware that dark love, once awakened, does not fade quietly, it demands reckoning. And the city, always hungry for blood or miracles, waited to see which would come first. The kind that makes the city's pulse feel uneven even in the silence before dawn. And Victor Moretti could sense the subtle tremors of a war forming beneath the surface, because Kane's shadow had stretched farther than anyone imagined, and his provocations were no longer mere threats but calculated tests of loyalty, influence, and morality. And inside the Moretti estate, Lucas sat beside Nero, the dog's paw resting gently on his shoulder, as if sharing the weight of unspoken knowledge. And Victor watched from across the hall, realizing that the boy's presence was both a shield and a mirror, reflecting the man he was and the man he wanted to become. And Isabella moved quietly between them, her eyes sharp, noting every nuance, understanding that this delicate balance of humanity and power was fragile, more so than any vault, more so than any army Victor commanded, and the day began with meetings that spanned the city, calling in old allies, brokers of influence, and men whose loyalty was transactional yet essential, because New York City power and contacts control demanded appearances, alliances, and intimidation in equal measure, and yet even as these men conferred in darkened rooms, Victor's mind returned again and again to Luca, to the boy's calm insistence that Nero could sense fear, desperation, and pain, and Victor realized that he had underestimated the strength in such subtlety, because Cain relied on brute force and chaos, while Luca and Nero moved in quiet certainty, untouchable by fear, and Victor made a decision that shocked his inner circle. He would not strike first, he would not act out of fear, but would allow Luca and Nero to guide the next move, trusting instincts honed not by money or violence but by survival and understanding. And that night, the streets of New York witnessed a strange alignment. Small crews that had once followed Cain's every order began to falter, confused by the absence of immediate retaliation, and whispers of Victor's mercy spread like wildfire, because the city had rarely seen power tempered by morality, and in the shadows, Cain seethed, unable to comprehend why his usual tactics failed, and as Victor returned home, he found Luca and Sophia walking together in the garden, Nero padding silently beside them, and Sophia asked Luca why the dog always stopped at certain places, why he seemed to know before anyone else, and Luca explained in quiet words, he doesn't just smell people, he feels them. He knows who's in pain, who's afraid, and he chooses the safest path, and Victor listened, heart tightening, because that path had just led him to reclaim his daughter without shedding the blood he had expected to spill, and Isabella joined them then, reminding Victor that such success was precarious, and Cain would not stop, that power tested weakness relentlessly, and Victor knew she was right, but he also understood that this lesson had reshaped him, that morality could coexist with influence, if wielded carefully, and as the night deepened, a message arrived via encrypted line, Cain's men daring him to show weakness, to reveal his humanity, to make a mistake, and Victor, for the first time in decades, smiled quietly, because he had already shown it, and the world had not collapsed. Instead it had revealed a new equation, where fear was no longer the only language, where loyalty could be earned with respect, and as he retired to his study, the city alive with restless energy outside, Victor finally allowed himself to think of what this meant for Sophia, for Luca, for the dog who had guided them all, and for the empire that had always been built on domination, not care. And somewhere deep inside, he understood that the choices made tonight would echo through the underworld, reshaping alliances, testing devotion, and revealing truths about dark love, power, and unexpected loyalty. And when Victor finally lay down, exhausted yet alert, he knew one certainty: the coming days would demand courage beyond muscle, influence beyond money, and a willingness to embrace the humanity that could either save him or destroy everything he had built. And as Lucas slept beside Nero, oblivious to the empire-altering events unfolding around him, Victor whispered a vow into the quiet: I will protect them, no matter the cost. And for the first time, that promise was not just about his daughter, it was about a boy, a dog, and a city that had never seen power tempered by love. The night air over the Moretti estate hung heavy with a mixture of damp fog and the faint scent of wet asphalt drifting from the streets below, and Victor Moretti sat alone in his private study, the room dimly lit by amber light that reflected off polished mahogany and the scattered documents that always reminded him of the empire he ruled. And yet tonight, none of it mattered, because his thoughts were entirely consumed by the boy Luca, the dog Nero, and the fragile thread of hope that had returned to him in the form of his daughter Sophia. And Victor leaned back in his chair, swirling whiskey in a crystal glass, watching shadows dance along the walls, wondering how quickly the city could forget the events of the past week, how quickly Cain and his men would regroup, and whether this fragile balance between power and morality could hold. And as he pondered, Luca emerged from the corridor, silent as a shadow, carrying a folder of maps, notes, and sketches of the city streets, his Small frame almost swallowed by the oversized blazer Victor had insisted he wear, and yet there was a gravity in his presence, an intensity in his eyes that had nothing to do with age, and Victor realized that the boy had been absorbing more than he let on, learning not only the streets, but the people, the nuances, the subtle currents of fear, loyalty and influence that governed the city, and Victor's respect for him grew, quietly, dangerously, because respect for someone else meant a shift in power, a surrender in ways his underworld peers would never forgive, and Luca placed the folder carefully on the table, and without looking up, said, "I've been tracking movements. Kane's men are regrouping near the Hudson warehouses. They're testing boundaries, looking for weak spots. They'll try to provoke your men tonight." Victor's eyes narrowed, his mind calculating the inevitable confrontation that had been building since the subway tunnel rescue, and he replied, "And what do you propose we do?" And Luca's head tilted slightly, eyes steady and unflinching. "We don't confront them directly. We let Nero lead. He can sense fear, desperation. He'll guide us to the safest path to reclaim our control without unnecessary bloodshed. And if they act foolishly," Luca's voice grew quieter, almost whispering, "they'll find themselves facing consequences they never imagined." Victor leaned back, considering the boy's words. Instinct told him to ignore them, to act like any other kingpin in his position, to send his men in to crush the threat, but the instincts that had once served him so well felt brittle now, replaced by the subtle wisdom of a child who had learned to survive the streets by observing, listening, and reading danger invisible to most. And as he watched Luca, Nero sitting perfectly still at his feet, Victor realized that this partnership, this unspoken alliance between boy, dog, and kingpin, was something entirely new, a force that relied not on intimidation alone, but on perception, patience, and understanding. By the time evening fell, the streets outside the Moretti estate buzzed faintly with movement, the distant wail of sirens blending with the hum of the city that never truly slept, and Victor convened a council in his inner sanctum, Isabella at his side, Luca and Nero quietly observing, and the men who had followed him for decades, some by loyalty, some by fear, filling the room with their presence, heavy with expectation. Victor began, "Tonight we test Kane. Not with violence, but with strategy. We show him that our power is not just in our arms, but in our minds, and in our choices. Luca will guide us. Nero will lead us. Follow them." Murmurs erupted among the seasoned enforcers. One of Victor's lieutenants, a man hardened by decades in mafia clubs and street wars, spoke up sharply, "Boss, this is madness. We let a child and a dog dictate our movements. This is not how power works." Victor's gaze turned icy, cutting through the room. "Power," he said slowly, "is not just about fear. It's about survival. And tonight, survival requires listening." Outside the estate, Nero padded quietly through the gardens, Luca following carefully, maps clutched to his chest, his movements precise, controlled, almost ceremonial in their patience, and Victor trailed behind them in the black armored convoy, his men in silence, alert to every flicker of light, every shadow that moved too quickly, every whisper that might carry Kane's intent. They crossed neighborhoods where the city's decay pressed close, alleyways smelling of damp concrete and refuse, the faint echo of life that had nothing to do with money or power, humanity in its rawest form, and Victor noted it all silently, because in this landscape, the weak were prey, the strong survived, and Luca had been both, and yet, despite everything, he remained calm, observing, calculating. By midnight, they reached the edges of the Hudson warehouses, abandoned structures stretching like jagged teeth against the dark sky, broken windows glinting with faint reflections of distant streetlights, and here, Nero halted, his body tense, ears pricked, nose quivering slightly, and Luca knelt beside him, whispering softly, "Go slow. Feel the energy. They're watching, but fear is the loudest sound." Victor's men tensed, gripping weapons, ready to assert dominance, to assert control in ways the boy had warned against, and Victor raised a hand, signaling patience, allowing the tension to build, letting Kane's men believe they had time, space, and advantage, because this was the subtle play of power, the kind that could decide an empire without a single shot fired. Hours passed in this careful dance. Kane's men tested boundaries, sending provocations, small fires, threats scrawled on walls, messages delivered by frightened couriers, all intended to bait Victor into reaction, and Victor felt the pressure, the pulse of the city pressing against him, but Luca remained steady, Nero moving quietly, observing, feeling, leading them down paths Kane's men had not anticipated, paths that allowed Victor's forces to reposition without confrontation, silently establishing dominance, control not with bullets, but with presence and calculated fear, and for Victor, this was transformative. He had learned, perhaps for the first time, that power combined with restraint was more terrifying than power wielded with violence. Then came the moment of reckoning. Kane, frustrated by the lack of overt retaliation, made his mistake. A group of his men, confident, arrogant, unaware of the unseen eyes tracking them, attempted to breach a district under Victor's indirect protection, intending to reclaim territory, humiliate his followers, and assert dominance, and in that moment, Nero reacted first. The dog's movement was swift, calculated, running along shadows, alerting Luca, who signaled Victor, who responded with precision, deploying men strategically, cutting off escape routes, isolating the intruders, not with chaos, but with a web of control that Kane had never predicted, and within moments, the arrogant group found themselves trapped, facing consequences without a single shot fired, humbled, shaken, and Victor's calm voice cut through the night, "You test my patience. You test my rules. You will not survive disrespecting the city or its people." The captured men, faces pale, voices trembling, realized that the power they had once thought simple and brutal was now nuanced, intelligent, guided by a hand that was merciful yet ruthless, and Luca observed quietly, Nero at his side, the boy's heart steady, mind sharp, absorbing every movement, every tactic, understanding that influence could be exerted without leaving a trail of blood, and Victor realized that this child and dog had taught him a lesson that money, guns, or fear alone never could. True dominance lies in understanding, patience, and empathy, a dangerous combination in a city that thrives on cruelty. As dawn approached, Victor stood overlooking the river from a quiet rooftop near the warehouses, Sofia asleep in the estate, Isabella beside him, and Luca and Nero returning home under careful watch, and he thought about the city below, about the delicate balance he now commanded, and about Kane, who would not relent, who would plot, who would return with force or deception, and Victor smiled quietly, a dangerous, controlled smile, because he knew the city had changed, his empire had changed. And he had changed, all because a boy and his dog had shown him that power tempered by humanity was not weakness, it was invincible. And as the morning sun reflected off the Hudson, painting gold across broken concrete and silent streets, Victor realized the truth. Kane's threats were not over, but Victor had gained something far greater than revenge or territory. He had gained insight, strategy, loyalty, and the unpredictable, unstoppable bond between a boy, a dog, and the most powerful man in New York City, and this bond would guide them through the trials to come, through conflicts yet unseen, through the delicate dance of dark love, loyalty, morality, and dominance that define the world of Mafia. And as the city stirred to life, Victor whispered under his breath, "This is just the beginning." The dawn had barely broken over New York City when Victor Moretti began his day with a weight he could neither dismiss nor share. The events of the Hudson warehouses still echoed in his mind, the trap they had set for Kane's men playing over and over like a silent drum beat in his chest, and yet, even as he walked through the grand halls of his estate, flanked by men who had once feared his temper more than life itself, he could feel a shift, subtle and insistent, because power tempered by morality carried its own tension, an almost unbearable gravity that made every decision sharper, heavier, and infinitely more dangerous, and Luca, ever observant, followed quietly behind, Nero padding silently beside him, ears alert, tail low but controlled, reading the energy of the house and its inhabitants with uncanny precision, and Victor noted this with a mixture of admiration and unease, because in the boy's calm awareness lay a force he had never before encountered, a blend of patience, intelligence, and instinct that even seasoned enforcers lacked. As breakfast passed quietly, Sophia appeared, still pale from her ordeal, but determined to reclaim normalcy, her voice soft yet insistent as she questioned Luca about Nero, about the tunnels, and about how a dog could possibly sense so much, and Luca responded gently, explaining the connection he shared with Nero, how the dog could feel fear, pain, and desperation, and Victor listened silently, the words settling over him like a second wave of revelation, because in this simple relationship between boy and dog lay a lesson about trust, loyalty, and power that no man in the city had ever taught him, and Isabella watched too, her sharp mind noting the subtle changes in Victor's demeanor, the way his eyes softened when he listened, the almost imperceptible tension that eased when Lucas spoke, and she wondered whether the city could survive the transformation of its most feared ruler into something so unpredictably human. By mid-morning, Victor summoned his closest lieutenants, men who controlled docks, clubs, and underground trades, into his office for a briefing that was more strategy than discussion, and as they entered, whispers of the Hudson incident followed them, rumors that Victor had allowed a child and his dog to dictate movements spreading quietly through the ranks, and while some frowned at the perceived softness, Victor's demeanor radiated controlled authority, an aura that reminded them all that weakness was not being tested here. Precision, patience, and understanding were now the weapons, and any misstep would have consequences as lethal as a bullet. Victor spoke calmly, detailing Kane's movements, his strategy, and the subtle provocations designed to destabilize his operations, and Luca, standing quietly beside Nero, offered insights from observations, patterns in the streets, and behaviors that no human informant could have provided, and while his input seemed improbable to some men, Victor affirmed it with a nod, reinforcing the unspoken truth that the boy's instincts were now as integral to the empire as muscle, money, or reputation. And as the briefing concluded, Victor decided on a silent, proactive approach, deploying his forces subtly, reclaiming control without overt confrontation, creating a network of influence that Kane could not anticipate, and as the day wore on, the city's undercurrent of fear and respect shifted imperceptibly, tilting the balance of power back toward Victor without the spectacle of violence, and every move was calculated with precision, each choice deliberate, reflecting the rare combination of strategic mind and emotional insight that now defined his leadership. As evening approached, Victor decided to take Luca and Nero on a reconnaissance of territories once under Kane's influence, areas abandoned, reclaimed, or contested, walking through narrow alleys, old warehouses, and decaying docks where shadows moved like whispers, and the city seemed to watch them, aware of the unusual presence of the boy and his dog alongside its most formidable ruler, and at each step, Nero paused, sniffed, and indicated paths that avoided unseen dangers, while Luca read the environment, noting potential threats, allies, and the subtle shifts in tension among those who remained loyal, and Victor observed, absorbing lessons he had ignored in his relentless rise to power, recognizing that dominance required more than fear, it required awareness, connection, and a calculated display of restraint that Kane could not predict or manipulate. In the late hours, news reached them that a faction of Kane's loyalists had attempted to rally support in Brooklyn, exploiting the recent perception of Victor's humanity as weakness, and Victor smiled coldly, realizing that their miscalculation would cost them, because every move had been anticipated, every angle accounted for by the boy, the dog, and the intelligence network Victor's empire had perfected over decades, now enhanced by an unexpected element, the empathy and foresight that Luca and Nero brought, and the unfolding trap was swift, silent, and surgical, containing Kane's men without violence, isolating their influence, and demonstrating to the city that power wielded with understanding and precision was far more terrifying than brute force alone, and as Victor returned to the estate under the faint glow of streetlights, he felt a rare sense of satisfaction, a balance between control and conscience that was both exhilarating and perilous. Later that night, as the city slept under a blanket of mist and distant sirens, Victor found Luca tending to Nero, checking his paws and ensuring the dog was ready for the days ahead, and Sophia appeared beside them, her expression a mixture of curiosity and relief, and Victor spoke softly, "You've changed more than just my city tonight. You've reminded me what it means to protect, to understand, to survive," and Luca looked up at him, eyes steady. "I've only been doing what I always did: watch, listen, survive. But together, we're stronger," and Victor nodded, a rare moment of vulnerability passing between them, as the weight of leadership pressed down, tempered now by the recognition that loyalty, morality, and dark love could coexist, and that sometimes, the most powerful moves required patience and observation, qualities he had long dismissed as unnecessary in the ruthless calculus of mafia rule. The night deepened, shadows stretching long across the estate, and Victor stood at the balcony overlooking the Hudson, Sophia asleep inside, Isabella watching quietly from the doorway, Luca and Nero resting. The city sprawled before him like a living organism of light and danger, and he understood fully that Cain would not relent, that power would continue to be tested, and that every choice made henceforth would ripple far beyond these walls, affecting allies, enemies, and the fragile bonds now forming. And in that awareness, Victor found a new resolve, a commitment to wield authority with precision, tempered by compassion, and to guide his family, his empire, and the city through a complex game of morality, loyalty, and power, knowing that the presence of one boy and one dog had forever altered the trajectory of his world. And as the first hints of dawn touched the skyline, Victor whispered into the night, "We've only begun. And no one will underestimate us again." The city's pulse was quieter than usual as Part 8 unfolded, though beneath the surface, tension coiled like a serpent ready to strike, and Victor Moretti moved through his estate with a careful, deliberate pace, every step measured, every glance calculated, because the events of the past weeks had taught him that dominance without vigilance was as dangerous as ignorance itself, and yet, even as he walked, his thoughts remained tangled in the quiet determination of Luca and the unerring instincts of Nero, realizing that a boy and a dog had become as integral to his control as money, muscle, and influence ever had been. Victor convened his council early that morning, Isabella at his side, Luca standing quietly with Nero in the corner, both observing, both aware that this meeting would shape the next phase of the power struggle with Cain, and the men who had served him for decades, accustomed to brute orders and immediate obedience, felt an unusual tension in the room, sensing that their kingpin had shifted, that mercy and calculation now intertwined with strategy, and that the boy's quiet presence was not just symbolic, but operational, altering the way decisions were weighed and executed. Reports arrived of Cain's latest attempts to destabilize Victor's holdings, subtle sabotages in shipping docks, whispers of disloyalty among minor crews, and a growing network of informants feeding false information to test Victor's reactions, and Victor listened carefully, his mind mapping each threat, each opportunity, each subtle misstep that could be exploited, while Luca's insights proved invaluable, pointing out patterns that even seasoned lieutenants had missed, noting routes of escape, places of vulnerability, and the likely behavior of Cain's enforcers under stress. And as Victor absorbed this, he understood something fundamental: power is not only maintained through strength, but through perception, timing, and understanding of both human nature and the undercurrents of fear. By midday, Victor decided on a subtle offensive, one designed not to provoke Cain, but to reclaim territory and influence quietly, with precision. Small teams moved through the city under cover, securing key points, restoring loyalty among hesitant factions, and quietly sending messages that Victor remained untouchable, not through terror alone, but through intelligence, patience, and the unseen guidance of Luca and Nero, whose movements were silent, precise, and effective beyond what words could convey. And as dusk approached, Victor gathered his inner circle again, this time to integrate Luca more fully into operational planning. Explaining the risks, the rules, and the consequences, while the boy listened, taking mental notes, asking subtle questions that challenged assumptions and opened new perspectives, and Victor felt a strange mixture of pride and unease, realizing that he had never trusted anyone so openly with the mechanics of his empire, not even his oldest lieutenants. Night fell, and the streets of New York seemed alive with anticipation, shadows stretching long across alleyways, the distant hum of traffic punctuated by occasional sirens, and Victor, Luca, and Nero moved together into contested neighborhoods, a quiet yet formidable presence that commanded attention without confrontation, and Kane's men, eager for chaos, underestimated the trio, misreading calm for weakness, and that misjudgment would cost them, because patience, precision, and insight were more lethal than guns when applied strategically. Inside one of the abandoned warehouses Kane had sought to use as a staging ground, his men were caught in a delicate trap, surrounded subtly by Victor's loyalists who had been guided by Luca's observations, positioning, and timing, and as the realization dawned that they were isolated, Kane's enforcers panicked, their carefully orchestrated assault crumbling, and Victor's calm, commanding voice echoed across the space, "You came to challenge power. Now you will see the difference between force and control," and the men, unable to counter the strategy, surrendered in stages, humiliated and disoriented, while Victor stood above them, observing quietly, absorbing every expression, every misstep, recognizing that mastery of influence extended beyond brute strength, into the realm of intellect, anticipation, and moral authority, and Luca, beside him, nodded subtly, Nero attentive, the dog's instincts reinforcing the boy's guidance, a partnership that had transformed the landscape of their empire. Returning to the estate in the early hours, Victor found Sophia waiting in the library, awake despite the late hour, her eyes bright with a mixture of curiosity and concern, and as Victor explained the evening's events, she listened intently, sensing the delicate balance of power, the tension between mercy and dominance, and the importance of the boy and the dog who had guided them through peril, and when she asked softly if Kane would return, Victor's face remained unreadable, but his hand rested briefly on her shoulder, a quiet reassurance that conveyed both strength and vulnerability, and Luca, observing the interaction, understood the nuances of human connection, the unspoken currents that guided behavior, and recognized that power without understanding of those connections was brittle, prone to collapse, and ultimately, meaningless. Later, as dawn began to break over the horizon, casting pale light across the city, Victor stood on the balcony overlooking his holdings, Isabella at his side, the estate quiet except for the soft breathing of Luca and Nero, sleeping in the room below, and he reflected on the profound transformation that had occurred. A boy and a dog had altered the trajectory of his empire, reshaping his approach to control, loyalty, and morality, and while Kane remained a threat, plotting, scheming, and waiting for mistakes, Victor understood that his greatest advantage now lay not in force alone, but in the subtle orchestration of observation, patience, and ethical strategy, and as the city came to life, unaware of the silent battles being waged in its streets, Victor whispered a vow into the morning air, a promise to protect, to guide, and to lead not only through fear, but through understanding, and he knew, deep in his chest, that the trials ahead would demand every ounce of cunning, courage, and humanity he possessed, because in the world of dark love, mafia loyalty, and the fragile balance of power, the most dangerous moves are often those made with conscience as sharp as a blade. And so Part 8 closed with the city sprawling beneath him, a web of light, shadow, and uncertainty, Victor resolute, Luca observing, Nero vigilant, and the promise of confrontation, revelation, and transformation simmering in the night, for the story was far from over, and the next chapter would test not only the empire, but the hearts, loyalties, and unexpected love that now bound them together in ways even Kane could not predict. The night had fallen like a heavy curtain over New York City, shrouding the streets in shadows and muted lights, yet within the walls of the Moretti estate, a tension unlike any before gripped Victor Moretti, because Kane's subtle provocations had grown bolder, testing not only his control but his moral compass, and Victor, seasoned by decades of ruthless power, felt a rare and unsettling uncertainty, tempered only by the steady presence of Luca and Nero, who had become both guides and mirrors. Reflecting the instincts, patience, and unspoken wisdom that Victor had long ignored in favor of brute force. Victor convened a private council in the dimly lit study, Isabella at his side, her sharp eyes catching every nuance, every flicker of doubt, every shift in expression among the assembled lieutenants, men who had followed Victor through decades of violence, manipulation, and unyielding authority, men accustomed to orders delivered with clarity and absolute expectation, and yet tonight, the rules were different, the hierarchy subtly altered by the presence of a boy and a dog whose intuition and perception had already rewritten the game, and Victor opened the meeting with a calm that belied the storm gathering outside. "Cain is escalating," Victor said, voice low but carrying, resonating with authority, "and he believes my restraint is weakness. He believes my humanity is a flaw. He will act tonight to test both. But we will not be baited. We will not rush. We observe. We control. We strike only when the outcome is absolute." Luca stood beside Nero, quiet, alert, but every word he had spoken before, every insight into patterns, movements, and instinctive behavior, now carried weight. He pointed to a map of the city, detailing Cain's likely staging grounds, his probable escape routes, and subtle clues only a boy trained by survival on the streets and guided by a dog's instincts could detect. Victor listened carefully, cross-referencing Luca's observations with the intelligence reports from his seasoned operatives. For the first time in decades, a child's insight held as much value as that of the most experienced lieutenant in the room, and the men shifted uneasily, some impressed, some unconvinced, but all silent in the face of Victor's calculated approval. As night deepened, Victor, Luca, and Nero prepared to move, the estate quiet save for the subtle rustle of the dog's movements and Luca's careful footsteps. Victor's convoy moved through the city with disciplined precision, silent shadows blending into the urban landscape, observing, monitoring, positioning themselves strategically without provoking confrontation, because the city had eyes and ears, and Cain thrived on misperception. They reached the edge of a district under contest, a network of warehouses long abandoned but strategically vital, and here, the tension became almost tangible, a coiled energy that prickled Victor's senses, demanding alertness, patience, and discipline. Nero paused at the edge of the perimeter, muscles tense, nose twitching, eyes sharp, and Luca knelt beside him, whispering in quiet, controlled tones, "Wait. Feel their intent. Do not act until you know their weakness." Victor's men, weapons poised, were restrained by a single nod, an unspoken command from a kingpin who had learned to trust what was unseen, and Cain's operatives, confident in their plans, moved as predicted, unaware of the silent orchestration that now guided every step, every choice, every decision. Hours passed in this silent dance of observation and anticipation. Cain's men probed boundaries, tested loyalty, and attempted subtle incursions into Victor's sphere of influence, each move carefully recorded, analyzed, and countered with finesse that left them frustrated, confused, and increasingly desperate, because the city was teaching them a lesson they had not expected, that control does not always roar, sometimes it whispers, it waits, and it strikes without warning when weakness is revealed. Then came the moment of reckoning. Cain, blinded by arrogance, sent a group of his most aggressive men into a trap, an abandoned dock where Victor's forces lay in silent ambush, guided by Luca's insight and Nero's acute instincts. The intruders, expecting ease and dominance, were met with precision, isolation, and the quiet weight of consequences. Victor's voice carried across the darkness, calm, resolute, slicing through fear, "You chose recklessness. You misjudged. And now you pay the price for your arrogance." No bullets were fired, no chaos erupted, yet the lesson was clear, and Cain's men, trapped and powerless, experienced humiliation and fear in a manner far more profound than physical injury, a calculated strike of authority that demonstrated control without violence. Returning to the estate in the early morning, Victor observed the city below, its lights twinkling like a sea of potential and danger, and he thought of Sophia, sleeping safely within the walls, of Isabella, poised and vigilant, and of Luca and Nero, embodiments of instinct, patience, and unexpected power. He realized that his empire, once built purely on fear, intimidation, and dominance, had been transformed, infused with subtlety, insight, and moral calculation, and that the most dangerous force in New York was no longer mere violence, it was understanding, tempered by empathy, and wielded with precision. Victor took a quiet walk through the estate, finding Luca tending to Nero, inspecting his paws, ensuring he was prepared for whatever came next, and Sophia, awakening, joined them, her eyes bright, her voice soft yet determined, asking questions about the night's events, about the traps, about the strategy that had protected them all without bloodshed, and Victor explained with care, emphasizing the lessons of patience, perception, and strategic morality, knowing that these lessons were shaping the boy into more than a survivor. They were shaping him into a force capable of guiding, influencing, and surviving in a city defined by chaos and power struggles. As dawn broke, Victor, standing once more on the balcony, reflected on the precarious balance of his world. Cain would not relent, threats would continue, and power would always be tested, but he now understood that control required more than muscle, influence, or intimidation. It required foresight, patience, and the rare wisdom found in the bond between a boy and a dog, and as the city awoke below him, unaware of the silent victories and strategic lessons unfolding in the shadows, Victor whispered a vow, "We've changed the rules. And the city will learn that power guided by conscience is invincible." And thus Part 9 closed, a chapter of careful observation, strategic mastery, and emotional growth, setting the stage for deeper confrontations, moral dilemmas, and the evolving bonds of dark love, loyalty, and unexpected alliances that would define the next phase of Victor Moretti's reign over New York. The city had grown restless by the time Part 10 began, a simmering tension beneath the hum of streetlights and distant traffic, because Cain had regrouped, adapting to the subtle lessons Victor had imposed, testing boundaries with renewed vigor, and the streets whispered of a reckoning yet to come, a collision between patience and aggression, morality and ambition, strategy and brute force, and Victor Moretti, standing at the edge of his estate balcony, watched the faint glow of the city, his mind a precise calculation of risk, loyalty, and influence, because power in New York demanded constant vigilance, and the moment hesitation arose, opportunity slipped into the hands of those willing to exploit weakness. Inside the estate, Luca and Nero prepared for the night's movements, the dog's muscles coiled, instincts finely tuned, while the boy's sharp eyes scanned maps, reports, and subtle signals, noting patterns, timing, and shifts in Cain's operations, and Victor observed silently, admiring the focus, the calm, the discipline, realizing that these two, child and dog, had become not just companions, but extensions of his own perception and power, and that the empire he had built on intimidation now moved in tandem with intuition, patience, and calculated foresight, a combination Cain had never faced, and one that could redefine dominance itself. Victor convened his inner circle in the early evening, Isabella at his side, lieutenants tense, the atmosphere thick with expectation, and he explained the plan with measured precision, a simultaneous operation across multiple zones where Cain's influence lingered, carefully timed to reclaim territory, restore loyalty, and expose weakness, all while avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. Luca's observations were integrated into the operation, guiding deployment, timing, and positioning, while Nero's instincts offered a layer of preternatural awareness, anticipating ambushes and detecting subtle signs of danger invisible to the human eye, and the result was a choreography of movement, intelligence, and moral restraint, executed with flawless efficiency. As darkness enveloped the city, Victor, Luca, and Nero moved through contested districts, their presence silent yet commanding, a shadow that carried authority and quiet menace, and Cain's operatives, sensing a shift, became increasingly reckless, underestimating the precision of Victor's response and the insight guiding it, and in the labyrinth of streets, alleys, and abandoned warehouses, traps were set, exits sealed, and isolated groups found themselves confronted not by gunfire, but by strategic containment and psychological dominance, realizing too late that miscalculation, arrogance, and haste could be punished more efficiently than bullets ever could. In one key confrontation at a dockside warehouse, Kane's men attempted to flank Victor's forces, believing his restraint indicated weakness, but the trap laid by Luca's observations and Nero's guidance was executed with surgical precision, isolating the group, cutting off escape, and forcing surrender through calculated positioning and psychological pressure rather than violence, and Victor's voice carried over the scene, calm and resonant. "You assumed mercy meant weakness. You misread power. Now understand it," and Kane's men, humiliated, shaken, and disoriented, recognized that dominance could manifest in silence, strategy, and moral authority, a lesson far deeper than any physical defeat. Returning to the estate in the early hours, the trio found Sophia awake, her presence a quiet reminder of what had initiated the transformation, and Victor explained with care the events of the night, emphasizing the lessons of observation, patience, and calculated restraint, the importance of understanding human behavior, loyalty, and influence, and the subtle power of guiding without overt aggression, and Sophia absorbed the details with quiet curiosity, sensing the delicate balance between fear, respect, and love that now defined her father's empire, and Luca nodded, understanding that the lessons of the night extended beyond strategy into morality, empathy, and the unexpected forms power could take. Victor spent the following day reviewing reports, analyzing movement patterns, and planning future operations, integrating Luca's insights fully into the network of intelligence, while Nero patrolled the estate, vigilant, attuned to the slightest shift in energy, and Isabella ensured that state-level contacts, legitimate businesses, and the shadowed corridors of mafia influence remained synchronized with Victor's strategic vision, creating a web of control that was precise, subtle, and far-reaching, a system that Kane could not easily unravel, and as the day turned to night, Victor realized the profound shift in his understanding of power. Control now relied not solely on fear or dominance, but on trust, insight, and the ability to predict, influence, and protect simultaneously. That evening, Victor walked the gardens alone for a moment, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here from ruthless kingpin, isolated in power, to a man who had learned to temper authority with empathy, guided by the instincts of a boy and his dog, and the knowledge that true strength lay in restraint, perception, and loyalty, and he understood that Kane's eventual confrontation was inevitable, yet now it would be met not with blind aggression, but with calculated intelligence, moral precision, and the unexpected unity of dark love, loyalty, and family bonds that extended beyond blood. As Part 10 drew to a close, Victor stood on the balcony, city lights stretching endlessly below, Sophia asleep safely inside, Isabella beside him, Luca and Nero resting quietly, and he whispered a solemn vow into the night, "We have changed the rules. And no one will underestimate the power of conscience, loyalty, and foresight, knowing that the coming days would demand courage, strategy, and moral strength, and that the bond between a kingpin, a boy, and a dog would continue to redefine what it meant to rule New York, shaping the empire, protecting loved ones, and challenging the underworld in ways no one including Kane had ever anticipated." The city had grown colder by the time Part 11 began, a brittle wind carrying the faint scent of rain and asphalt through the streets, and Victor Moretti stood in the quiet of his study, contemplating the relentless tide of Kane's scheming, which had evolved from crude aggression to subtle, insidious threats, testing not just territory but loyalty, morality, and the very limits of his patience, and Victor, seasoned in the ruthless calculus of power, felt an unfamiliar tension gnawing at the edges of his resolve, tempered only by the presence of Luca and Nero, whose calm precision had become the cornerstone of his empire's survival. That evening, Victor convened an emergency council, Isabella at his side, her gaze sharp and unwavering, noting every flicker of expression in the assembled lieutenants, men who had followed him for decades through violence, deception, and the absolute assertion of authority, and who now faced a leadership transformed, tempered by insight, restraint, and a subtle understanding of human behavior that was as effective as it was unprecedented, and Lucas stood quietly near Nero, watching, listening, absorbing every word, every movement, every shift in tension that could inform the knight's strategy. Reports indicated that Cain had initiated a coordinated assault on multiple fronts, deploying loyalists to test Victor's influence, spread disinformation, and attempt to reclaim territory under the assumption that his recent restraint signaled weakness, and Victor, analyzing the intelligence, realized the stakes were higher than ever, because Cain's reach now extended to those who had once been neutral, swaying them with the perception of vulnerability, and the city below became a chessboard where every move carried life or death consequences. Victor's plan was precise, a multi-layered approach integrating both conventional strategy and the subtle instincts of his unconventional allies. Lucas' keen perception guided the deployment of forces, identifying hidden threats, probable ambush points, and escape routes, while Nero's instincts provided an additional layer of preternatural awareness, detecting unseen dangers and signaling subtle shifts in the environment that no human could perceive, and together, the boy and the dog created a silent, intelligent network that allowed Victor to operate with surgical precision, striking fear not through violence alone, but through anticipation, control, and the assertion of invisible dominance. As night fell, Victor, Luca, and Nero moved into contested neighborhoods, their presence almost ghost-like, blending with shadows, silent, disciplined, and commanding, and Cain's operatives, emboldened by arrogance and misreading the calm for weakness, walked unknowingly into traps laid with precision, isolation, and psychological mastery, and Victor's voice, calm and commanding, cut through the darkness. You test power with recklessness. Now understand the consequences of underestimating it, and the men, trapped, disoriented, and stripped of their perceived advantage, experienced a lesson far deeper than mere physical defeat, one that underscored the potency of insight, patience, and moral authority in the ruthless world of mafia control. The confrontation escalated when Cain himself appeared, attempting to seize advantage in the chaos, confident in his manipulation of fear, reputation, and perception, and Victor, observing with calculated patience, allowed Cain to believe he was in control, guiding the movements of his forces subtly, anticipating Cain's every maneuver, while Luca and Nero acted as extensions of his perception, reading intent, signaling shifts, and ensuring that the confrontation would be resolved on Victor's terms, and not through the hasty aggression Cain sought. In the climactic moment, Cain, frustrated by his inability to provoke Victor into direct conflict, attempted a final act of desperation, a bold intrusion designed to strike at the heart of the Moretti Empire, but Victor, armed with insight, strategic foresight, and the unconventional guidance of Luca and Nero, countered with flawless execution. Cain's men were isolated, the intrusion contained, and Cain himself faced the controlled authority of a ruler who had learned to wield power through understanding, restraint, and the subtle manipulation of perception, and in the quiet aftermath, the lesson was undeniable: dominance tempered by morality, patience, and insight was an instrument far more terrifying than any weapon. Returning to the estate in the early morning, Victor found Sophia awake, her expression a mixture of relief, awe, and curiosity, and he explained the events with care, emphasizing the principles that had guided the knight's victory: observation, patience, and understanding of human behavior, loyalty, and subtle power. While Luca and Nero rested nearby, their presence a quiet reminder of the unlikely alliance that had shaped the outcome, and Sophia absorbed the lessons with quiet determination. Recognizing that power, when combined with insight and compassion, could protect, guide, and transform in ways brute force never could. Victor spent the following hours consolidating gains, analyzing outcomes, and preparing for the inevitable countermeasures Cain would attempt, while Isabella ensured that the network of influence, legitimate business, and state-level connections remained synchronized with the strategic vision, creating a web of control that was precise, flexible, and resilient. And Victor, reflecting on the transformation of his empire, understood that the combination of insight, morality, and unconventional guidance had created an unstoppable force, capable of navigating the complexities of the underworld, sustaining loyalty and ensuring the safety of those he loved, and that this force had been forged not through fear alone, but through the quiet, profound impact of a boy and his dog. Victor stood once more on the balcony overlooking the city, lights shimmering like scattered stars over streets thick with both danger and possibility, and he whispered a vow into the night, a promise of continued vigilance, loyalty, and moral strength. This empire, our family, and our city will endure, guided by insight, restraint, and the unbreakable bond of loyalty and love, and he knew that the trials ahead would test every aspect of his power, strategy, and conscience, but that with Luca and Nero by his side, he could meet any challenge, because the future of New York's underworld would no longer be determined by fear alone, but by the calculated, unexpected force of humanity intertwined with authority, and as dawn broke, painting the skyline in gold, Victor realized the final reckoning with Kane was near, and that the outcome would redefine loyalty, power, and the meaning of dark love forever. The city held its breath as Part 12 began, a tense silence that stretched across streets, alleys, and abandoned docks, because Kane, cornered yet defiant, was preparing his final move, a desperate gambit that could either reclaim his fading influence or obliterate him completely, and Victor Moretti, standing in the quiet of his estate with Isabella beside him, observed the city like a chessboard, every street, alley, and shadow mapped in his mind, every potential threat and opportunity calculated, while Luca and Nero prepared in tandem, silent, precise, and unflinching, their bond a quiet yet formidable force that had come to define the very nature of Victor's power. Victor's mind raced through strategies, contingency plans, and subtle psychological maneuvers, knowing that Kane's desperation made him unpredictable, yet understanding that the same desperation also revealed his weaknesses, his arrogance, and his impatience, and he realized that tonight, the fate of not just his empire but the lives of those he loved, Sofia, Isabella, Luca, and even the quiet loyalty of Nero would be decided, and every choice he made carried weight heavier than any bullet or blade. By evening, Victor mobilized his inner circle, deploying forces strategically across the city's contested zones, using the intelligence network he had perfected over decades, now augmented by the insight of Luca and the acute instincts of Nero, creating a silent web of control that Kane could neither predict nor escape, while Kane, confident in his last act, moved boldly, attempting to draw Victor into a confrontation on his terms, unaware that he was stepping into a trap crafted with precision, patience, and foresight. The confrontation began at a dilapidated waterfront warehouse, fog rolling off the Hudson like ghostly fingers, obscuring vision, heightening tension, and Kane's men moved with reckless confidence, seeking to exploit perceived hesitation, yet they were met not with immediate aggression but with coordinated containment, subtle isolation, and psychological dominance, guided by Luca's observations and Nero's instincts, a quiet orchestration of fear and respect that rendered Kane's boldness impotent, and Victor watched from the shadows, calm, calculating, and ready to strike at the precise moment that ensured victory while minimizing unnecessary bloodshed. Inside the warehouse, Kane attempted to confront Victor directly, his presence radiating menace, yet Victor allowed the illusion of advantage to persist, guiding the environment, manipulating perception, and using the boy and the dog as extensions of his awareness, anticipating Kane's every move, every gesture, every subtle signal, and as the confrontation reached its zenith, the city seemed to hold its breath, the tension almost palpable, a silent theater of power, loyalty, and moral authority that was more deadly than any open battle. In the climactic moment, Victor acted with precision, not through violence alone but through strategic dominance, isolating Kane, cutting off his escape, and forcing recognition of a truth that Kane had long resisted, that power tempered by insight, patience, and moral clarity was superior to brute force, and Kane, realizing the magnitude of his miscalculation, experienced a moment of clarity tinged with fear, as Victor's calm, commanding voice articulated a principle Cain could never have learned through violence alone. You misjudged the rules of power. Fear alone does not rule. Understanding, strategy, and loyalty are the truest weapons. As the dust settled and Cain's men surrendered or fled, Victor approached Cain, the weight of his authority undeniable yet tempered with restraint, offering a choice that combined mercy with consequence, a demonstration of power that was not solely rooted in brutality but in the recognition of intelligence, morality, and control. And Cain, humbled yet defiant, understood the lesson, that the landscape of New York's underworld had been permanently altered, shaped by the unlikely alliance of a kingpin, a boy and a dog, a force that combined insight, instinct, and unexpected love in a way that no adversary could overcome. Returning to the estate, Victor found Sophia awake, her eyes reflecting awe, relief, and understanding, and he explained the events with care, emphasizing the lessons of patience, observation, and moral calculation, the importance of loyalty, the subtle influence of perception, and the unexpected ways that insight could triumph over aggression, while Luca and Nero, resting nearby, symbolized the quiet, profound force that had guided the entire operation, and Sophia, absorbing every word, realized that the bonds of trust, love, and loyalty were now as integral to power as money, muscle, or influence. In the quiet that followed, Victor reflected on the journey, from ruthless domination to calculated moral authority, from fear-driven control to influence tempered by insight and empathy, and he recognized that Luca and Nero had reshaped his understanding of leadership, loyalty, and the true nature of power, and that the future of his empire, his family, and his city would be defined not by brutality alone but by the strategic, moral, and emotional intelligence that now guided them all. As dawn broke over New York City, casting a golden light over streets that had been witness to conflict, strategy, and transformation, Victor stood on the balcony, Sophia by his side, Isabella observing quietly, Luca and Nero resting nearby, and he whispered a vow into the rising sun: "We have endured, we have learned, and together we will shape a city that understands the true strength of loyalty, love, and calculated power." And in that moment, the empire was secure, the bonds were unbreakable. And the story of dark love, unexpected loyalty, and moral authority had reached its dramatic, emotional, and satisfying climax, leaving a legacy that would be remembered in the underworld, in the hearts of the family, and in the quiet, unwavering gaze of a boy and his dog who had changed everything.